What truly destabilizes an avoidant is not silence itself, but the moment they realize the emotional dynamic no longer revolves around their need for distance. As long as someone is chasing, waiting, over-explaining, or emotionally orbiting around them, the avoidant nervous system still feels psychologically in control of the connection. Even if they feel overwhelmed, they unconsciously know the attachment remains available. But when someone quietly detaches with dignity, when they stop trying to force closeness and instead return fully to themselves, something shifts internally for the avoidant in a way that no argument or emotional plea ever could. Because for the first time, the avoidant is faced not with pressure, but with emotional reality. And emotional reality is much harder to avoid than emotional intensity. This is the paradox people misunderstand. Emotional chasing activates the avoidance defenses.
Curious. Emotional self-possession disarms them, not because it manipulates them, but because it removes the relational structure their nervous system had adapted to. The avoidant unconsciously expects distance to create pursuit. They expect withdrawal to trigger emotional reaching. That dynamic reinforces their sense of control and confirms their internal belief that intimacy eventually becomes emotionally consuming. But when the other person stops collapsing emotionally around their withdrawal, the avoidant loses the familiar pattern they were regulating against. That absence of pursuit creates something they are not emotionally prepared for: uncertainty. And uncertainty affects avoidance differently than overt emotional pressure does. Pressure pushes them away, but uncertainty quietly pulls their attention inward. They begin noticing the emotional space differently. They begin recognizing that the connection is no longer emotionally waiting for them in the same way. And because avoidance process attachment slowly and internally, this realization often emerges gradually rather than dramatically. It comes in fragments, in moments of silence, in emotional comparisons, in subtle recognition that the person they once experienced as emotionally available is no longer energetically attached in the same way. That is what creates destabilization, not punishment, not games, not no contact used as strategy, but genuine emotional detachment rooted in self-respect. Because self-respect communicates something powerful to the avoidant nervous system. It communicates that love can exist without emotional dependency. That connection does not automatically mean engulfment, pressure, or emotional collapse. And paradoxically, this is often the first time the avoidant begins to feel emotionally safe enough to truly reflect on the connection itself instead of merely regulating distance from it. However, this is also where an important distinction must be made. Emotional reflection is not the same as emotional transformation. An avoidant may begin missing someone more deeply once emotional pressure disappears. They may idealize the connection, revisit memories, feel emotional longing, or even experience regret. But longing alone does not automatically create relational readiness. Many avoidants remain internally attached to people they never fully return to because attachment and emotional capacity are not the same thing. This is why the goal should never be to trigger an avoidant into chasing you. That keeps the entire relationship trapped inside the same psychological framework of activation and withdrawal. The real shift happens when the anxious or emotionally overinvested partner stops organizing their emotional life around whether the avoidant comes closer or pulls away. That is the moment the cycle begins to break. Because the deepest truth underneath avoidant attachment is not that they fear love. It is that they fear losing themselves inside love. And when someone responds to their distance with grounded emotional independence rather than panic, the avoidant is confronted with a completely different experience of intimacy. One where closeness no longer feels synonymous with emotional pressure. Sometimes that realization becomes the beginning of growth. Sometimes it only becomes silent regret. But either way, the most powerful thing you can do is not to disappear in hopes of controlling their emotions. It is to genuinely reconnect with your own center so completely that your emotional stability no longer depends on their capacity to stay close. That is what changes the dynamic forever. In the end, the deepest truth about avoidant attachment is not that avoidants do not feel. It is that they have learned to survive by controlling what they feel, when they feel it, and how much of it they allow themselves to express. Their distance is not always rejection. Their silence is not always absence of care. Much of the time, it is a nervous system trying to preserve emotional control in the only way it ever learned how. That is why no contact, emotional pressure, or intense pursuit often fail to create the reaction people expect. Avoidants do not immediately collapse under distance. They stabilize inside it. What truly affects them is not emotional chaos, but the quiet disruption of the patterns they once depended on. When someone stops reacting predictably, stops chasing, stops over-explaining, and instead becomes calm, grounded, emotionally self-respecting, the avoidant can no longer rely on the old relational script. The familiar cycle breaks. For the first time, they are faced not with emotional pressure, but with emotional clarity. And clarity is what slowly forces reflection. They begin to notice what is no longer available automatically. They begin to feel the difference between temporary control and genuine connection. They begin to confront the possibility that emotional safety was never found in distance itself, but in the rare people who made closeness feel non-threatening. But this entire journey also reveals something equally important for the other person involved. Loving an avoidant cannot become a lifelong project of self-erasure. Understanding their psychology should never require abandoning your own emotional reality. You cannot spend your life shrinking your needs, suppressing your feelings, or living in constant analysis of someone else's wounds while your own heart slowly empties. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. Patience without reciprocity becomes exhaustion. And love without mutual emotional effort eventually turns into loneliness shared between two people. The real transformation happens when both people begin taking responsibility for their own healing. The avoidant learns that intimacy does not have to mean losing themselves. The anxious or emotionally pursuing partner learns that love cannot be earned through overgiving, over-explaining, or endless emotional labor. Both people stop operating from fear and start relating from stability, honesty, and self-awareness. Because in the end, relationships are not sustained by hidden feelings, internal conflict, or emotional potential. They are sustained by behavior, by consistency, by communication, by the willingness to stay emotionally present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. Feelings matter, but feelings alone are never enough. Love only becomes real when it is translated into action. And perhaps that is the final truth underneath this entire dynamic. The goal was never to become someone an avoidant could not leave. The goal was to become someone who no longer abandons themselves trying to hold on to people who are still running from intimacy. The moment you stop measuring your worth through another person's ability to stay, everything changes. You stop chasing emotional certainty from unavailable people. You stop confusing longing with love. You stop turning someone else's fear into your responsibility. And in that space, something healthier becomes possible. Not perfect love, not fantasy. Real love. The kind where two people can remain fully themselves without fear of being consumed, controlled, or abandoned. The kind where closeness no longer feels like danger. The kind where neither person has to disappear in order for the relationship to survive. In the end, the deepest shift in avoidant dynamics does not happen through emotional force. It does not happen because someone chased harder, argued louder, disappeared dramatically, or tried to create pain intense enough to force realization. Avoidant individuals do not typically transform through emotional shock. They adapt to pressure by creating more distance. The more emotionally overwhelmed they feel, the more their nervous system moves toward protection, control, and withdrawal. That is why so many relationships become trapped in repeating cycles of pursuit and retreat without ever reaching true emotional understanding. What actually changes the dynamic is something far quieter and far more powerful. Calm emotional accountability. The moment someone stops reacting predictably, stops feeding emotional chaos, and begins responding from grounded self-respect instead of fear, the entire emotional structure of the relationship changes. The avoidant can no longer rely on the old script where distance creates pursuit and silence guarantees emotional access. For the first time, they are faced not with emotional intensity, but with emotional reality. And reality is much harder to avoid than conflict. When emotional chasing disappears, when over-explaining stops, and when the relationship is no longer driven by desperation for reassurance, the avoidant loses the automatic emotional patterns they once depended on. This does not immediately create panic or dramatic emotional confession. Instead, it creates something more psychologically significant: reflection. Their mind begins to observe instead of simply react. They begin to notice patterns, consequences, and shifts in emotional availability that were previously hidden beneath emotional noise. This is why genuine emotional detachment paired with self-respect becomes so impactful. Not because it is manipulation, but because it removes automaticity from the relationship. It forces conscious evaluation where there was once only unconscious repetition. The avoidant begins to realize that emotional connection is not endlessly available regardless of behavior. They begin to see that calmness does not always mean permanence, and that someone emotionally stable can quietly step back without anger, drama, or pursuit. At the same time, this process reveals an equally important truth for the other person involved. The goal should never become trying to strategically unlock someone else's capacity for intimacy while abandoning your own emotional needs in the process. Real emotional maturity is not learning how to tolerate inconsistency forever. It is learning how to remain compassionate without sacrificing your own stability, self-respect, or peace of mind. Because ultimately, no relationship can survive on hidden feelings alone. Internal conflict is not the same as emotional availability. Longing is not the same as commitment. And emotional depth means very little if it never becomes consistent behavior. Relationships are built through repeated actions, emotional responsibility, communication, and mutual willingness to remain present even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. The deeper truth underneath all of this is simple. Avoidants are not heartless. Most are deeply protective of emotional wounds they never fully learned to process safely. But protection can become prison if it prevents genuine closeness from ever fully forming. And no amount of love from another person can heal that unless they themselves become willing to confront the fear underneath the distance. So the real power is not in becoming emotionally unavailable in return. It is in becoming emotionally grounded, calm enough not to chase, clear enough not to confuse potential with reality, strong enough to allow consequences without turning them into punishment, and secure enough to understand that someone else's inability to fully meet you emotionally is not a reflection of your worth. Because in the end, real love is not built through emotional games, psychological tactics, or endless decoding of another person's wounds. It is built when two people are both willing to face themselves honestly, communicate openly, and create safety without requiring either person to disappear in order for the relationship to survive. And so, when you step back and look at this entire dynamic clearly, the deepest truth is not that avoidant people do not love, do not feel, or do not attach. The truth is far more complicated and far more human than that. Avoidant individuals often feel deeply, sometimes even painfully deeply, but they experience closeness through a nervous system that has learned to associate vulnerability with danger, emotional dependence with loss of control, and intimacy with the risk of being overwhelmed. Because of that, their instinct is not to move toward emotional intensity, but to regulate it, contain it, and often escape from it when it becomes too activating. This is why so many people misunderstand what happens during distance, silence, or no contact. From the outside, it can look cold. It can feel personal. It can seem as though the avoidant simply does not care. But internally, their emotional process works differently. Separation does not initially register as emotional collapse. It often registers as relief, as regained control, as a return to emotional equilibrium after the pressure of closeness became too intense for their system to comfortably manage. That relief, however, should never be confused with emotional absence. Calmness is not always the absence of attachment. Sometimes it is simply the absence of activation. Over time, if the connection carried genuine emotional significance, the avoidant mind begins to process what the relationship actually meant. But even then, they rarely process it through dramatic emotional urgency. They process it cognitively, gradually through reflection, memory, comparison, and observation. Their emotional awareness develops slowly because their system prioritizes regulation before vulnerability. They need clarity before they can safely access feeling. And that is one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant psychology. They are not primarily driven by emotional intensity. They are driven by emotional safety, predictability, and control over their internal state. This is why emotional pressure almost always backfires. Chasing, demanding reassurance, escalating emotionally, trying to provoke reaction, or using silence as punishment often only reinforces the avoidant belief that intimacy is emotionally chaotic and unsafe. The more emotionally flooded the relationship becomes, the more their nervous system shifts toward withdrawal and self-protection. What many people mistake for indifference is often an overwhelmed system trying to restore stability the only way it knows how. And yet, the real turning point in these dynamics does not come from emotional force. It comes from emotional groundedness. The most psychologically significant shift occurs when someone stops participating in the old cycle entirely. When they stop chasing after distance, stop over-explaining silence, stop organizing their emotional life around someone else's inconsistency, stop reacting impulsively to withdrawal, and instead become emotionally self-contained, calm, and deeply rooted in their own self-respect. This is not emotional coldness, it is emotional maturity. When emotional predictability disappears, the avoidant can no longer rely on the familiar relational script, where withdrawal automatically creates pursuit and reassurance remains endlessly available regardless of behavior. For the first time, they are forced into conscious evaluation rather than unconscious repetition. The relationship no longer functions on autopilot. The old emotional ecosystem breaks apart, and in that quiet disruption, something important begins to happen. Reflection replaces assumption. They start noticing that their usual distancing behaviors no longer create the same outcomes. They begin to recognize that emotional access is no longer guaranteed. They observe calm detachment instead of emotional chaos, and because the dynamic is no longer fueled by pursuit and reaction, the avoidant mind finally has the space to process the relationship without immediately shifting into defensive regulation. That is why calm emotional accountability becomes so powerful. Not punishment, not revenge, not emotional games, just reality. A grounded response to behavior. A quiet understanding that connection cannot survive indefinitely without consistency, reciprocity, and emotional presence. This type of accountability does not scream. It does not beg. It does not attempt to emotionally overpower the avoidant into transformation. Instead, it allows consequences to exist naturally, and over time, that reality becomes difficult to ignore. But perhaps the most important truth underneath this entire conversation is not actually about the avoidant at all. It is about the person who keeps trying to love them. Because somewhere along the way, many people trapped in these dynamics begin to confuse understanding with responsibility. They study attachment styles, analyze withdrawal patterns, overfunction emotionally, and convince themselves that if they can just become patient enough, calm enough, secure enough, or understanding enough, they can finally create the conditions where the avoidant will stay fully present. But no amount of emotional intelligence can do another person's healing for them. You can create safety. You can offer compassion. You can communicate with maturity. You can stop feeding emotional chaos. You can become deeply secure within yourself. But you cannot force someone to confront fears they are still committed to avoiding. And this is where the deeper lesson emerges. The real goal was never to become the one person an avoidant could not leave. The goal was never to master someone's psychology well enough to finally earn stable love from them. The real goal is to stop abandoning yourself while trying to keep someone else emotionally comfortable. Because love should not require the constant suppression of your emotional needs in order to remain intact. You should not have to calculate whether your feelings are too much. You should not have to earn basic emotional consistency through endless patience. You should not have to live in constant analysis of someone else's wounds while ignoring the erosion of your own peace. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-abandonment. Patience without reciprocity becomes emotional exhaustion. Understanding without mutual effort becomes loneliness disguised as love. Real relationships are not sustained by hidden feelings, internal conflict, or emotional potential. They are sustained by behavior, by consistency, by communication, by emotional responsibility, by two people repeatedly choosing to remain present even when intimacy feels uncomfortable or vulnerable. Feelings matter, but feelings alone do not build secure relationships. What matters is whether those feelings become actions, whether vulnerability becomes communication, whether care becomes consistency, whether connection becomes something stable enough to trust. And perhaps that is the final truth at the center of all avoidant dynamics. Avoidants do not need someone to chase them harder. They need to eventually confront the fear beneath their distance. And the person who loves them does not need to become smaller, quieter, or endlessly self-sacrificing in order to keep the connection alive. They need to become more grounded, more self-respecting, and more honest about what kind of love they are actually receiving. Because real love is not emotional survival. It is not anxiety management. It is not decoding mixed signals or waiting for potential to become reality. Real love is calm. Real love is mutual. Real love allows both people to remain fully themselves without fear of being consumed, abandoned, or emotionally erased. And when two people are finally capable of meeting each other from that place, not from fear, not from control, not from old wounds reenacting themselves through distance and pursuit, but from emotional awareness and genuine willingness, intimacy stops feeling like danger. It starts feeling like home.